attorney at the Climate Defense Project, which is a bit of a misnomer. Kira and I are both staff attorneys there. The Climate Defense Project originated as a legal shop to help folks who wanted to bring a necessity defense, primarily who were doing direct actions in the climate justice space. But we've since sort of had a revisioning that recognizes the intersectionality of these many liberatory fights. And so a lot of our work is not necessarily what you would traditionally think of as within the climate silo that often sort of gets artificially created in our nonprofit system. And yeah, I started this work as a public defender and have since transitioned to representing primarily activists. That started for me during the Line 3 construction summer. I'm not sure if folks remember when Line 3 was being constructed across northern Minnesota. There were nearly 1,000 people who were arrested and criminally charged, and so I was one of many, many attorneys that joined that effort to make sure that everyone had counsel as they were facing criminal charges there. And then was lucky to land at CDP and meet Kira, and we've been co-counseling ever since. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Kira. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. Really excited to be here and grateful for all of you taking the time to hang out with us this morning. Also a staff attorney at the Climate Defense Project, and I guess just a little bit about my trajectory. Kind of similar to the trajectory of the Climate Defense Project itself. I started really with an environmental focus, was an engineer before going to law school, and then had this realization that we have a lot of smart people out there, and what we don't have is distributed power and the ability to have smart, compassionate people making these decisions that impact us. So went to law school, have been doing a lot of criminal defense for climate protesters, but also more and more legal support for racial justice movements, the Palestine solidarity movements, et cetera. And yeah, just think about, like, when I think about that, I think about something my dad said when he was like, are you doing all of this, like, other stuff, the racial justice and the human rights, because you've given up on climate change? And I was like, no, I'm doing this because I haven't, and this is how we win for all of us. So really trying to have an intersectional framework for this training, and like I'm hearing that from even just the backgrounds that you all are bringing, so I'm really excited to be a part of this group today.
So we will dive in. Sort of just as a housekeeping item to start, we are coming into this space sort of assuming that within this room even, and certainly within the communities that we're organizing within and working with, there are a variety of political identities, political analyses of what we're doing and what the movement is. That is not a barrier to what we're doing today. Collaboration is cool. Diversity is how we grow. And so sort of recognizing that the things that we talk about today are rooted in what we imagine are our shared values that we're bringing to this space, even if we might not necessarily all agree on the specific political labels that we might use for ourselves. I think it's something that's important to discuss, even when we're talking to a group that might consider themselves left of center, for example. There's a lot of variety and diversity of views within that, and that's not a barrier to us all coming together and working together and finding ways to keep each other all safe as we're doing work that increasingly people are realizing the ways in which it's criminalized. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you all know that, like, indivisible, right? That Trump got elected by pitting people against each other along these kind of fractured lines. So we're trying to come back together, understand. And do we want to share some values? If people want to do a go-round, or you can pass, that's totally fine, and just name a value that you want to unite under. So I'll start compassion, and I'll pass.
I went to school for environmental science, so yeah, climate efforts are always fun. Yeah.
Cool.
Facts. Knowledge.
Knowledge. Yeah.
I was literally going to say the same Interdependence. All of the above.
I'll jump in with rule of law.
Solidarity.
Defending the Constitution. Here, here. Get out. Equity. Equality under the law. Inclusiveness. Everyone deserves a chance to thrive.
Empathy.
I'm going to go with him. Say empathy. Empathy, compassion.
Community.
I'll share curiosity. So with that said, our goal for this training is collective liberation in the most broad sense, right? When we think about what are we doing here, what's our ultimate goal? And so to that end, really our only request from you all is that you, as you take this information and maybe think about it in the shower or talk to your friends about it or talk to your networks and people that you're organizing with about it. The only rule, I don't know if it's a rule, it's a request, is that you not share this with law enforcement. Our approach to this work is from a criminal defense perspective, that we're trying to help people break free from the legal systems that are criminalizing them and oppressing them and may impact or may have impacted you or people that you love. And so that's really the one request that we have from you all today. Otherwise, take this information and do what you will with it.
With the caveat that we also might put this on the internet later, so.
And we're going to talk about the surveillance state a little bit too, so,
So don't feel free to confess to crimes. This is not the space for anyone to no crime confessionals for the next hour and a half. But we want to just try to have this be an internal conversation. So yeah, really excited about those values. I think that that as our foundation leaves us in a really strong place to go through this conversation together. And what our goal here is know your rights is kind of what it's conventionally called, but a lot of folks are framing it as know your risks. And that's because the Constitution was really only written for a very limited subsect of the population. And so we want I'm finding myself in this day and age cheering for the Constitution, which I've never done before. Because it's what we've got, but we deserve so much better and so much more. So we're going to use it to the extent that we can to protect ourselves, each other, further these values of compassion, solidarity, but know that it's not perfect. And has anybody heard that poem, First They Came for the... Yeah. We are living that right now. I would posit that we have been living that since Christopher Columbus and colonization, and that we're just in a period of rapid expansion of the category of who they're coming for. That they've been coming for particularly Black folks, indigenous folks, they've been coming for immigrants, they've been coming for communists, they've been coming, all of these different people, and now they're coming for Habitat for Humanity. Did you hear about Trump was investigating Habitat for Humanity? They are coming for puppies, this is the kind of egregious expansion of that category. They are coming for green card holders, not just folks who are undocumented or underdocumented. So what we're doing right now is they're coming for the straight married women who have changed their last names. They're coming for the white queer people when we know they've been coming really hard for our Black trans siblings and sisters for a long time. So we're where are we on this list? And how can we be strategic to stop this march down the list before there's no one left? So I think that's kind of where we're at, why we're all here. And I've been thinking a lot about strategy, because it's how do we be effective and not just do stuff because we're scared and we feel like we need to take action? How can we be as safe as possible while being effective? And what is the scarce resource right now that we should be trying to grow and disseminate? And I don't think it's compassion. I've seen so much compassion and so much care, so much energy, so much attention since political analysis. And so how do we hone our political analysis and disseminate effective strategic means of like stopping the march down this list?
Right, because, you know, as Kira's mentioning, it's not really new, right? It's new in scope, perhaps. It's new in the categories of people who are being targeted. The people who are now being targeted increasingly include people who felt safe before. But that doesn't mean that what's happening is new. It means that more of us were able to ignore what was happening when the people that it was happening to were disenfranchised, were stigmatized, were pushed into that corner over there, and it was easier for the rest of us to like go on and live our lives and sort of not pay attention to what's happening over there. It's also important to understand that the Democrats are not angels in this, right? There's a lot of talk about the crime bill that Joe Biden authored. Certainly that laid the stage for a lot of harms that we've seen in the expansion of the criminal state. Whether or not you want to fault Joe Biden for that 25 years ago or 30 years ago plus, I'm not here to debate that. We can talk about the politics of that. But the reality is, in the past few years even, there are many things that the Democrats could have done to shrink the criminal state or change the tools in the toolbox and make them fewer, right? Closing Guantanamo Bay, codifying Roe v. Wade. There's things that could have been done, but what we actually end up seeing is from both political parties, as they get in charge, they continue to expand and grow the criminal state, but they use whatever their political talking points are to sort of frame that expansion in a way that is more palatable to the people that they're trying to talk to, right? So a lot of people, sort of think back to going on 20 years, close to 2 decades ago now. I feel like I'm getting really old. But, George Bush was, compared to Obama, was pro-immigration, was very supportive of immigrants, compared to the Obama regime, which, was greatly expanding the infrastructure to deport people, which then laid the groundwork for Trump to separate and cage children and families, and everyone was really up in arms about that. But then Joe Biden got elected, and that didn't actually change. We were still caging children and separating families. I mean, it's important to just understand. I do think that, I'm not trying to say that the parties are equal, but I think it's important to recognize the ways in which there's this push that we see that just continues to expand the criminal state. And if we aren't sort of wise to what's happening, it goes back to the Niemöller poem, right? First they came for. And I guess the one other thing I wanted to share about that, when Democrats get elected as attorney generals or prosecutors, they often end up caging more people than Republicans because they are often criticized as being not tough on crime enough. And so there's this theory that they then overcompensate. And so it's just sort of important to keep your eyes open to what's the rhetoric and what's actually happening. And it's important to keep in mind the broader that criminal net gets, the more vulnerable we all are to it when someone comes into power who now has access to those tools.
I think another way to put this, ExxonMobil donates equally to the Republicans and the Democrats. They benefit no matter who's in power. So our goal here is to be power belongs with the people. And the power belongs behind compassion and not corporations and not people that are trying to divide us and lock us up and profit profit off of our imprisonment. So really what we're trying to say is like, keep your power and use it. And yeah, I guess like, time for my favorite rant ever. So people throw the words protest, civil disobedience, direct action around a lot. And I'm not right about this, I'm just really passionate about it. So this is the semantic framework I like to use. Feel free to use it if you want. You don't have to. I like to think of protest as like holding a sign, being like, please give me health care. You're like asking somebody with power over you to use that power in a way that like is less stomping on you. Oftentimes the people that we're like holding the sign to are being paid by gajillionaires to continue stomping on us. So it's not the most effective means of like getting what the sign says. It can be a cool way to bring people out, bring people together, draw attention to an issue, vent, but it's not directly doing the thing you want to do. Direct action, on the other hand, that's when people come together with their individual and collective power to accomplish their goal. So I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but anybody have an example of like direct action, like mutual aid, like something where you do the thing? It's okay, not yet.
Volunteering for an organization that supports the community, or
Yeah, so if you want to see your community like better served, serving your community is a way to do that. If you want to stop a pipeline that's being put through treaty territory that doesn't have proper permits and is like doomed to explode and destroy an ecosystem, you could just like petition the governor and say, hey, please don't put this pipeline in. But he's being paid by that pipeline company. So that would be the protest, and it has its place. And just like, you know, not to value one tactic over another, but just to say that's different than a direct action where somebody might physically go and like put their body on the line and say, actually, this pipeline is in violation of this treaty. That's the supreme law of the land. You know, I'm not advocating that anybody go out and trespass, but just defining a term. So that's direct action, is you and your community directly achieving the result. It's not always unlawful, like doing service work, doing mutual aid for your community. Like in Vermont, where I'm from, the first Tuesday in March, the town votes on how to spend their community money. And we couldn't get healthcare on the state level, but my town voted to have a community nurse. So there's a part-time nurse who just like goes around and does like direct immediate care work specifically for elder folks and underserved communities in my town. So they couldn't get healthcare by voting or pressuring their governor, but they could create that for themselves. That's direct action. You're like, I want this to happen, I'm gonna make it happen, and it's not gonna depend on asking permission. And then the third category, which sometimes overlaps, is civil disobedience. And that's like the fun one. That's where you see a rule that is unjust, and you symbolically break it to show that it's unjust. It could be a cultural norm too, like when Chick-fil-A started being super homophobic and all of the queers started going to Chick-fil-A to make out. That's like cultural disobedience. Civil disobedience is, you know, like, I mean, we could think of all kinds of laws that are unjust. And
I mean, sitting at the lunch counters, right, is the very famous example from the civil rights era.
yeah,
It was illegal. It was against the law, and people did it to protest a law that was patently unjust, and they were arrested.
yeah, and that's kind of both too, because they were also doing direct action by like directly creating a multiracial environment in a segregated community and breaking the law that prohibited that. So those are some different kind of things to think about when you're trying to like, when you're trying to get to your goal, like asking yourself, okay, what's my goal? How do I get there? And which tactics do I want to use to get there? Something that we see that's not so effective is when people get excited about a tactic, and then they're like, I'm going to do this tactic because this is what I know how to do. But if it doesn't further your goal, or if it's risky, or if it subjects you to things that like, you know, collateral damage, other people could get hurt, and it doesn't get to your goal, like maybe it's time to kind of like do the Patrick and make a plan.
Yeah. And, you know, one big area where we see people kind of drastically underestimating the risks that they're taking is in dealing with which is, I think, why we're here today, right? So thanks for bearing with us on that long introduction. We'll get to it. Spoiler, we actually got some more like setting the stage things to talk about. But anyways, yeah, because it's not my job as a criminal defense attorney to tell someone not to break the law. I understand that there are many laws that are unjust. I have a political analysis that informs me of the fact that like a lot of the things that I appreciate about the world that I live in, I have access to because people were breaking the law, right? What my job is to tell someone, hey, you said you want to do this thing, that's actually against the law. Here are the consequences, and it's ultimately up to that person to decide like what to do with that information, right? We all have autonomy in that way. With that said, there are risks that come with any form of protesting activity or activity that's sort of like resistant to the system. Those risks are varied based on the type of activity that you're engaging in, as Kira's just said, right? There's like sort of 3 broad categories that we can talk about, and those go from less to more risk of having a negative interaction with law enforcement. But I would be lying to you if I said that was the only metric, right? We know identity is a huge part of who is getting targeted by law enforcement, and there's a variety of other, economic level and like location and politics that influence that as well. With that said, forgot to talk about the St. Paul principles. Just for anyone that's not familiar, the St. Paul principles are sort of a framework for engaging when people are deciding to adopt a variety of different tactics in furtherance of the same or similar goals. In recognition that in order to achieve what we want to achieve, it often takes many people taking different tactics, right? If you use the civil rights era, it took people getting arrested at counters. It also took people advocating with their legislators. It took people talking to their neighbors. It took like all kinds of work and organizing that was happening. And so the St. Paul principles are really just a way of recognizing that we should all be working together, or at least not undermining each other's different tactics that are in furtherance of these same liberatory goals that we're all pushing for. And it actually came out of organizing in St. Paul, Minnesota. So all the more reason to know your St. Paul principles as people working and organizing in Minnesota.
When did these come about?
This was 2008, right?
In response to the Republican National Convention?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context of policing, just to sort of make sure that we're all oriented to some of that, just in a very basic and cursory way. If this is something that you're not familiar with, there's a lot that's been written about this, and I encourage you to do your own digging and to do your own research. But really, law enforcement in the United States came out of 2 main historical purposes, really. And in the South, that was slave catchers, and in the North, that was Union busters. And you can see sort of pictures of both here that are represented. And that was really the origins of our modern day police forces. One interesting fact that I recently learned is that policing in America was initially seen as very un-American. It was actually criticized as a very un-American institution because of the context of the Revolution and the fight against the British and colonial rule and the quartering of soldiers. So when in 1840, for example, the NYPD was established, people were very, very up in arms, and there was a lot of organizing against the NYPD that focused on them being an un-American entity, which I think is sort of fascinating to see how the narrative of like what is or isn't American has been very much now co-opted by policing. disrespectful or rude to individual police officers. I'm not advocating at all any violence against police officers. In fact, I have personally had many relatively pleasant interactions with police officers and prosecutors, especially in my line of work. And I oftentimes come across officers who I think very much believe that they are doing the right thing. I think what's important to understand is that there's a difference between a kind person who is trying to do their best and somebody who is operating in a role that is deeply violent and that has a deeply violent structure and function in our society. And so I want to be really clear that, I think an important distinction there, that this is not about like telling some individual officer to go F themselves. Like if you want to do that, like I'm not going to tell you no, but we're all, again, autonomous beings who can like navigate that, and there might be someone who very well feels that way, and I've also encountered a lot of officers who I caught lying on the stand and doing very shady things, and I've seen a lot of really bad body camera. But I'm not like trying to have that argument. It's more about understanding the structural role that is at play here. I also think it's important to look at the stats because there is a lot of propaganda that we are fed. A lot. It is much more violent, or not violent, it is much more dangerous to be a pizza delivery driver than it is to be a police officer. It is much more dangerous to be a logger, someone who like works cutting down trees, than it is to be a police officer. There's this sort of like narrative that is not really true and that is perpetuated by things like Law and Order television shows and things like that. The reality is, if you look at the statistics, investing in policing does not lower crime rates, it actually increases them. Investing in healthcare, education, community is what lowers crime rates. And I have here a graph showing as you increase funding for law enforcement, homicide rates increase. Also, there are a lot of policing activities that are not the violent crime that we're told is the bulk of their work. The vast majority of what law enforcement is spending their time on is responding to non-criminal calls like, hey, I see a homeless person and I don't like a homeless person in my neighborhood. Like, can you go investigate that? It's stopping people for speeding and traffic offenses. It's property crime. It's proactive policing, which is very disturbing, where there's, stop and frisk is sort of the famous example from New York City. It's actually only about 4% of what law enforcement is doing is responding to violent crime. And it's also important to know that in addition to not preventing crime, law enforcement is also often not solving crime. In fact, we don't really have great numbers. This isn't something that I think has, at least in my research, I've not found great research explaining this in the US context, but in the UK, for example, where there's a very similar policing infrastructure, the vast majority of crimes that are being reported to police go unsolved.
Question.
Yes.
Okay, so the homicide one is breaking my brain a little bit. Could you expand on, I'm assuming that people aren't saying, oh, there's more cops, I'm gonna go kill more people. So why do we think that there's that?
Yeah, so there's the
I don't get it.
yeah. So there is an argument to be made, and I want to just be like intellectually honest about saying this, that some people might say, well, as the crime rate goes up, we need to hire more people. So this increase in funding is actually an example of responding to the homicide rate. I actually think politically that's not what is happening. If you sort of pay attention to like the interplay between the numbers and the political requests for funding, what's happening is police funding is coming from somewhere, and it's coming from our schools. It's coming from
my understanding that we don't have good national data collection or sharing, and so I'm kind of wondering where these outcomes are coming from.
Yeah.
Good to see the British, because I'm sure it's similar.
Yeah, so you're right. There have been some efforts to collect data on a nationwide scale. It's voluntary, and so local police departments contribute to it or don't. Obviously, these are, if you look at the top, coming from specific cities and police department forces, and I'm trying to remember where I got this one from. This was from, I would need to look it up and get back to you on the exact, but I can double check when I'm done with the presentation and let you know where it's from. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted a general response to it.
Yeah.
Because it's an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and you know, so you might be saying, what is the purpose of policing, right? If they're not making us more safe. One, I think we have been taught and socialized to believe that police make us more safe, and so many people end up feeling. Many people do not feel this way, but many people do feel more safe when there's police. This is an interesting, there's very interesting research about TSA and all of the security measures and what a hassle it is. They actually found that the more hassle that you experience when you're going through TSA, the more safe you feel. Not because it's more effective, but because the hassle in your brain is like, oh, if I have to go through this hassle, it must mean I'm more safe, because that's like how it's been marketed to us. I think there's a similar thing happening for some people with policing, but also, again, going back to the history, policing has often been about social control. And I want to give just a couple brief examples about that. You know, policing has targeted movements then and now. Some pretty, you know, graphic photos from the civil rights movement and from 2020 in Minneapolis. I think that this graph really, really hits home. Because think about what happens if someone steals your purse, right? We're at the library, you're looking at books, you're not paying attention, someone snatches your purse and leaves, you call the police. The police are gonna come and they are going to say, like, you know, if they're motivated to like solve the crime, they might like look at surveillance or whatever. If the person's there and you say that person stole my purse, that person might get arrested, right? Police are gonna like go into action against that person. What happens if you call and you say, hey, I'm a worker and my boss is stealing my wages? Are the police gonna come and arrest your boss? No. They are going to say, okay, well that's a bummer, I guess, like try to find an attorney who will sue your employer, you know? But if we look at the harm that's caused, wage theft causes so much more harm in our communities than other types of theft, if we're looking at, you know, money value. Query, why is one a crime and one not? I would say it's because people who are owning businesses and who are committing these harms are also the people who have a lot of influence with legislators and who are the people that hold the power and the property that police are actually meant to protect. One other example I'll give, this is from Line 3. People knew when Line 3 construction was happening that Enbridge was not complying with its permits. Enbridge was illegally dumping chemicals into our precious waterways. They were actually stealing water that they did not have a permit to use in order to cool their systems. Those were harms that actually are crimes. And people were engaging in direct action. You can see actually the Shell River 7 elder women sat down in lawn chairs and refused to move in protest of Enbridge's crimes as a way to stop the construction from happening. And when law enforcement came, they said, we're glad you're here. There's some criminal activity we would really like you to investigate. And law enforcement said, you're under arrest. Put your hands behind your back. And they hauled those elder women off to jail, and the criminal process, processed them through. Several years later, Attorney General Ellison did end up filing charges against Enbridge for some of these harms. It was a slap on the wrist, like a small fine. That was like, once they paid it, the charges were dismissed. It was ridiculous compared to the experiences of people that, like hundreds of people, just short of 1,000 people who were caged. And again, why is that? Why is law enforcement, when they show up and they say, hey, there's this massive harm that's happening, and this corporation is causing it, law enforcement isn't investigating that harm. They're not going to arrest those CEOs, but they are going to arrest those seven elders who are, peacefully sitting on a boardwalk of a construction site.
So all of this preface just to say, when we have this conversation, when I have this conversation with people who have kind of been at the top of that list, first they came for 250 years, I don't really have this conversation before we talk about know your rights or know your risks. And I just have learned from the patients and lived experiences, and then from the more you see, the more you're oh my gosh, the conversation has to be different than an academic conversation of what does the Constitution say. The values of uphold the Constitution, uphold the rule of law, the people who we are told do that don't. They are going to do what they can get away with, and it's sort of for everyone's safety that we really try to hammer hard on the we keep us safe, and we have to undo the bajillion-dollar propaganda industry. There's $180 billion, or at least there was in 2020 when I was writing about this more extensively, that goes into our police and prison infrastructure in the U.S. It's probably more due to inflation and the increase in crime and prison spending, but $180 billion industry that we're told keeps us safe. And so it's terrifying and hard to be told or to be shown information that says, hey, actually they don't really care about you. They're there to uphold the social order and to protect corporations and actually to suppress protest. As an institution, again, what Claire was saying, it's this, growing up, I had a friend, he became law enforcement and I was walking down the street, again, in rural Vermont, and I see law enforcement, I see a cop car pull up, and I'm I'm in trouble. And he rolls down the window, and I'm it's my buddy Willie from childhood, and I'm oh, hey dude, what's up? And he's do you know whose dog this is? And I'm what? He's I found this dog. I'm just going around trying to find this. And I'm this guy's really nice. Does he need the money, the infrastructure, the firearms training, all of that to go around and help lost dogs go home? No. I would love it if that was his full-time job, and I think that's really what his heart wants to do. But he was told that becoming a cop, learning how to kill people, becoming legally authorized to kill people, that was the way to do that. So I really grieve for people that want to help their community and buy into that propaganda lie. And I think it's a personal choice for folks how you want to navigate these personal interactions. But just really appreciate Claire's deep historical dive and open invite to sidebar about this afterwards too. I recognize this is probably maybe not where we thought we would be spending so much time today. Maybe it's new information, maybe it's not, but I really want to just appreciate everyone for hearing this information, sitting with it even if it's uncomfortable, and open invitation to pull me aside afterwards if you want to process any of this. The framing is just really important because we are told that law enforcement are going to help us stay safe, and now we're in a political moment where we are trying to threaten a racist, violent, oppressive status quo, and they're nuh-uh, not on our watch. So how do we stay safe when we can't count on the people that we're told will protect us? The kind of historical examples of law enforcement suppressing protest movements, I think we've gone through a fair amount of that, the civil rights movement, obviously McCarthyism and the Red Scare, the suffragettes. We saw the Green Scare in the early 2000s. I mean, we see over and over when something really bad is happening, and somebody says, "Hey, something really bad is happening." Who's the one that gets arrested? You know, that's like I have clients out east who are trying to shut a coal plant down, and they were having a literal like peaceful kayak action where they were kayaking around outside a coal plant with little signs that said coal is bad. The New Hampshire Marine Patrol, like, I didn't know that was a division of the New Hampshire State Police, but apparently it is because their budget is ginormous. They like come up on speedboats and they like pull my clients out of their kayaks onto the speedboats and do a like mid-water arrest because they are like kayaking up and down a river, upset about the existence of a massive coal plant that is like killing people and dooming us all to the sixth mass extinction. Instead of being like, we should protect our community from the coal plant that's killing people, they're like, let's go get those kayakers and like pull them out of their boats. And that's like, you know, that's a very benign example compared to like the murder of Tortuguita in Cop City or like the brutalization of the protesters during the protests following George Floyd's murder. Yeah, question?
Well, it's not really a question so much as one of the things that disturbs me and worries me about some of these protests is what has happened with the deliberate militarization of the police over the last 2
Yeah.
to 3 decades, which has been very much partnership
Yeah.
between state, the federal military powers and the state, and that's been some of the increased budget.
Yeah.
That all costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
But then it puts the police in a very different position in the community
Yeah.
when they're looking at this military operation versus community safety operation.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and I'm really glad you brought that up because I think you're spot on, and we can look at like the 1033 program where the military donates their gently used tanks and assorted military weapons to local law enforcement, and that's when you see like local cops look more and more like army guys, like stormtroopers. Like, I don't know if we saw at Dartmouth on May 1st, out east last year, there was a literal vigil, like college students and elders from the community were like singing Kumbaya and holding candles and grieving the dead civilians slaughtered in Palestine. And the Dartmouth College like sent stormtroopers in, and they body slammed one of the faculty in the Jewish Studies department who was there just like checking in on her students, and they took a passersby and they like broke his collarbone because he was walking home and was like filming the protest and was like confused about what was going on. Like these are military operations being conducted by like the guys we went to middle school with. Like, it is terrifying. And we can look at Cop City, the one in Atlanta, or the ones popping up all over the country to see this partnership where local law enforcement from all over the country team up with the IOF, the Israeli military. They team up with international militaries, the U.S. military, and they like learn how better to suppress protests. They have like fake cities where they can learn how to do operations to like suppress people marching down the street who are upset at their oppression. So this is what we're up against, and it's, yeah, it is. I think you're just spot on. It's really scary, and we're not just seeing like our buddies with batons. These are buddies with tanks and guns and assault rifles and military training. Yeah.
And you don't see their faces at all.
Yeah. And
I feel like that's so dehumanizing and intentionally scary for all.
Yeah. A book I read most of that I would recommend, even though it was hard to read because it's really well cited, was Erica Chenoweth's book on civil resistance and like talking about the success of nonviolent resistance movements, not from a position of like morality or pacifism, but just like the efficacy of nonviolent movements. In part because of kind of what you're saying of like breaking down this dehumanization, that nonviolent movements are more likely to be multi-generational, because if you're like a bunch of militant guerrillas, like you really kind of have to be able-bodied 26-year-olds and able to like run and live in the woods and like train like army guys. But nonviolent movements where you have the grandmas out in the streets with their pots and their pans, like you're more likely to have like social ties between the military or the occupying, the police, whoever, and the grandmas, and like those like whistleblowers, those defections, getting people back to our side through a multi-generational, accessible, nonviolent movement that has like, I think the stats are like 3.5% of the population in active non-compliance with a fascist regime is like kind of the goal to like stop where we're going. And that 3.5% is much more feasible if people are able to like participate in a way that doesn't require like armed resistance. So the goal being like broad, non-violent, non-compliance with violent, oppressive regimes. Yeah.
Can you just clarify what you mean by active non-compliance? We were talking about protests earlier and their efficacy, but
Yeah. I
where's
can
the
give a
line?
couple examples. So we had a couple hundred people in Trump Tower who were members of Jewish Voices for Peace that were protesting the slaughter of Palestinians, and they got arrested. The New York Police Department arrested like several hundred members of Jewish Voices for Peace in Trump Towers, and city bus drivers got called in to like drive people to jail. So that would have been an opportunity for those city bus drivers to be like, no, I'm not driving these people to jail. There's a genocide going on. We're not doing this. Like I'm not gonna participate.
So
kind
that
of these like
3.5% seems much larger to me, because it's not just people out in the street. It is people actually taking action,
Yeah.
particular actions in defiance.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to, like, I think what I'm curious about and would love to like hear from others too, like, I think there's ways that all of us can do this. You know, whether you are not complying because you're a city bus driver and you're like, I'm not gonna do that, whether you are not complying because you're participating in boycott, divest, and sanctions of Israel, whether you are not complying because you you get a door knock from the FBI and they want you to rat out your neighbor who works for Habitat for Humanity, and you say, no, I'm not talking to you. That's a lawful action. Like, you're allowed to say no when law enforcement like try to get you to snitch. Whatever it might be, whether you're just like slamming the door in an ICE officer's face when he's trying to come and get your undocumented neighbor, whether you're, I don't know, what else? Yeah.
Not paying your taxes.
Yeah, tax resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah, having heard the request for examples,
Yeah.
an inspiring example for me is the other country I've lived in, which is Taiwan, where my wife grew up. When I first lived there, it was a one-party dictatorship. They had military police, and I'm talking, helmets, M16s, everywhere. I mean, in every public place,
Yeah.
you saw military police. They controlled all mass media. They controlled the school system. I mean, there was one voice about how to think, and that was the ruling party's voice.
Yeah.
How that regime changed so that Taiwan is now rated as more politically free than the United States by Freedom House was mostly the street protests. It was mostly doing what all of us can do, which is to hold signs in public places and let neighbors know that they disagree with the regime. When that began in the 1970s, the people who would do simple street protests like that I've done dozens of times, 4 or 5 years in prison, instant,
Wow.
all the time. I know some of the prisoners personally.
Yeah.
But that's what changed the regime. That.
Yeah.
Not even strike. Not even, many kinds of techniques that are called direct action.
Yeah.
Just simple public street protests was enough for a military dictatorship to give way to a pluralistic, multi-party democracy with full civil rights for all, first-gay marriage, and euthanasia, etc. Because it takes courage to do that.
Yeah.
And if people show they have courage, the regime stops fighting.
Yeah. Thank you for that really valuable example. That reminds me a little bit too of like Sri Lanka is another example of that. They have, I think, 20 million people, and they had 1 million people, just as you said, like out in the streets. And part of the impact of that too was like the disruption. Like, they're not going to work, they're not like punching in the capitalist grind, they're out on the streets. So that was enough disruption to like shut down the functioning of the regime, because people were like, I'm not going to participate in my daily, I'm not going to swear because we might be putting this on the internet, baloney. I'm going to go out on the streets with my pots and my pans and my sign and my grandma. Like, I'm going to fight. And by fight, we mean like peacefully protest, or whatever that entails. So like, I think that's a really good example of like, yeah, people just being out in numbers is really helpful, in part because they're not doing these other things that the regime needs to continue feeding itself. people are like, oh heck yeah, I want to be a part of that. Like
Yeah.
that's brilliant.
Oh, I was just gonna share when you talked about the bus drivers, if they had not, been willing to drive the buses. I was worked with homeless youth in the city of New York in the mid-80s, and I will say, there was a large contingent of homeless kids that lived in Grand Central Station. And during a particular cold snap, when the mayor of New York and the police chief of New York said these kids are out, because all the wealthy people going to work didn't, I think that's the other thing we have to realize is who are the cops serving? And, but they didn't want to see these kids. And to their credit, and I was so proud of them, the frontline cops in New York City said, we ain't doing it. We're not going to throw these kids out on the street.
Yeah.
And it should happen more often, and it
Yeah.
doesn't.
Yeah.
But the cops are tools too.
Right.
They for this wealthy elite, and I don't know who they are. I'm sure you have a better idea.
Yeah.
But
But in that moment, those human beings chose
Exactly.
to serve humanity
Like your
rather
buddy.
than the top-down orders of their like kind of inherently violent institution. Like
right,
that's-
and
yeah.
how do we turn some of the, not just the cops, but all these other institutional players, right,
Yeah.
to stand with us
Yeah.
instead of against us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've got a lot. Okay. Yeah. Let's go in a circle.
Well, before we leave the idea of the police, based on that, I was wondering and hoping that are different police forces different? Like, do you have in your mind, like, well, this group or this precinct or however they're categorized tend to be less bad, and this group, like, you better, like, if you see a cop, you should just, like, run? Like, you have it in your head that way?
I'll say growing up in the Twin Cities, like Minneapolis police compared to St. Paul police, night and day.
Yep.
Minneapolis police, it was like you better run. St. Paul police, like super cool, super chill, like not gonna like mess with you, right? That's like within the umbrella of still recognizing that like the role of law enforcement is to be oppressive, and they're taking orders from top down and they're being given specific tools, right? I think it's also important to recognize like the tools that law enforcement is most often being given is a tank. And if a tank is your tool, that's what you're going to use to solve the problems that you're presented with, right? So, but yeah, like I think it's certainly true. Like the more human connections that there are within a community, there might be more resistance to by individual law enforcement to the people that are trying to direct them, right? We saw that during Line 3. There was one sheriff of one county that actually had like deep personal relationships with the indigenous leadership. And some of the, I think like they've all gone to like, not all, but there was like gone to like K through 12 together, right? Like this was just like someone that you knew like your whole life growing up. And because of that sheriff was resistant to a lot of the most draconian policing efforts, right? People still got citations, but they didn't get maced, they didn't get sprayed with pepper bullets, right, in the process. Like it was much less violent. There's also, I think, an effort that we're seeing because the powers that be are recognizing this. Line 3 again is an example, and I think 2020, the summer of 2020 is an example. There are efforts to move law enforcement around and to create these task forces so that when you are protesting in your local community where you went to kindergarten with the sheriff, that sheriff isn't the one who's there. That sheriff's several counties over, and you're dealing with someone else who doesn't know you from anyone else and is pointing a like less lethal trajectory at your face, right? Like that's what we saw during Line 3.
I think the one thing that's also really important to add too is like different people are going to get different treatment. Like like law enforcement growing up in Vermont treated me one way, and then a completely different way when I was in the car in law school with my black friend and her mom teaching her how to drive. And like we swerved this far over the line, and she got a $250 ticket, and I got a warning for like entrustment, and we thought we were gonna get pulled that was a really different experience than anything I'd ever experienced from that same department, because the majority of folks in the car were black. So it's also like who we are is going to make a huge difference. Who we're with, what we're protesting about. You know, like climate protests generally get the gentlest treatment. I would say like Black Lives Matter and pro-Palestine protests get generally the worst treatment. Like to overgeneralize, even from the same department. Yeah.
Okay, this is a very uncomfortable question for me to ask, but
Yeah.
I mean, do we think police abolition is the answer?
But I don't think everyone has to. You know, I think that abolition is a horizon. It's a positive project. It's about like building the world where we don't even need them to solve the problems that we're told they do. But you know,
I don't think any of us disagree with that, but I think that there is like a path to getting there.
yeah,
And if we start here, it's like, because it's not A or B, right?
Yeah.
It's so much middle ground, and I think part of our issue now is that we say one thing and words matter, and if people don't understand what that actually means versus like, you know, the two words we use,
yeah,
you know, I think that is
Yeah.
a problem.
yeah. That's a great question, and like I don't mean to impose my beliefs on anyone else. And I think
It's just,
that's
I don't
like,
think any of us disagree.
Yeah.
I just think like, how can we talk about these things in
Totally.
a way that makes us all feel part of the solution versus
Yeah.
you're on team A or team B.
and that's I think why we did frame this with the like shared values go around and the St. Paul principles of like, I think it's okay if like we've got the same horizon and we're going in slightly different ways, as long as like I'm not undermining the work that you're doing, and vice versa. Like that it's okay to kind of like work together to take resources and put them back in communities without maybe the same exact labels and languages. I don't know. I think critical resistance has a really awesome chart that talks about the difference between reformist reforms and recuperative reforms, or abolitionist reforms. Yeah, it's abolitionist and reformist are the two. And it's like they're both incremental changes, but one is like incremental that works towards the horizon, and one is kind of like false solutions that are incremental changes that actually bring power and resources back into law enforcement in a way that undermines the route to that horizon. So I would highly recommend that chart as a way to kind of think about, okay, how can we get there, recognizing that we're not like for better or worse, nobody has a magic wand, so nobody actually has the authority to wave the wand and like disappear these systems overnight. Some of us might want to, others of us might not, but there's a lot of steps we can take where we do align on shared values without having to decide that.
I don't think there's a lot of working together or understanding of that piece. I think that sometimes we fight each other because one group wants to move, is more comfortable moving more slowly than the other.
Yeah.
And lack of recognition of like actually on the same team. And
Yeah.
that takes both of us to, because change doesn't happen overnight. And probably never will.
Right.
And so we really do work in partnership.
There's also
Yeah,
really,
that's important.
well, there's also just some really interesting stats on how, like when there are multiple like action pushes that are going on, the folks that are like seen as more radical, the fact that there's like more radical action happening actually makes the less radical action more likely to succeed. Which I think is really important to keep in mind as we're thinking about like St. Paul principles, right?
I'm
But
gonna take a stack of
I know you've had your hand up for a minute.
Black shirt, purple shirt.
Actually, if you can take Maddie's question.
Oh,
I
sorry.
think we'll have to go.
So, may I suggest that we're getting to a lot of really good conversations, but they're beyond the scope of today's session. In fact, I'm going to suggest that a number of us take notes and parking lot that, because one of the things ITC likes to do is engage something called Activism 101, where we can have a range of conversations, including, for example, reimagining public safety. But we should probably get to the rest of these folks' programs about, you've now made the decision to engage in direct action or civil disobedience or something. How do you get prepared for likely law enforcement response?
You've sidetracked me on one of my favorite conversations. Yeah, I want to climb on turn to Claire for the actual how do you do?
Oh, we'll bring you back to the other ones. So.
And I'll also just say, like, with that caveat, which I think is important, like, we should get to what we're, like, what we should probably be sharing with you all, because I'm not even, like, an organizing expert, right? Does anyone else have something, like, burning that they want to share that, yeah, go ahead.
I do want to contribute one thing that I think people are not aware is an opportunity to have a humans
Yep.
to make sure that they take their opportunities to serve on a jury. Because when a protester gets a charge against them, that's going to go to a jury. That gives them the strength and courage to know that they can plead not guilty, and there will be people who will nullify unjust laws, fill up those juries with decent humans, and some of this goes away. And it's one of the few instances where ordinary people have real power. Granted, there's machinery in place to try to shut down a lot of what juries can do now, but for now, it's real power.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. That's it. That's an even more favorite
Yeah,
rant.
talk about sidetracking me on my
Yeah, you're
favorite
making
rant.
it real hard.
Okay, let's talk after.
Oh gosh.
Is this
We'll
one
be
more
back,
burning question or thought?
Just, we're talking a lot about general stuff. I work very closely with MPD on a daily basis. If you have questions specifically about them and their policies, please come see me after. I would love to give you guys more info about that.
I'd like to add one thing too, and it builds on what Manny was saying. You might get to this, but a lot of us here are organizing protests, and we are in the language that you were using. And we have so many people who are attending protests now who never have ever in their entire lives, and people in their, even in their, 60s and 70s and probably 80s who are showing up for protests. And one of their main questions is one of the main questions as organizers we ask ourselves is, how are we going to keep people safe?
Yeah.
And oftentimes, so I really appreciate all this framing, because one of the main places our heads tend to go is, well, what's our relationship with the police, and what is their role in keeping these huge crowds of people safe? So I just wanted to put that out there, just because we're just seeing so many more new people to these movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. I think we're kind of, this slide and the next one, which I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation with a client. And it's always someone who is like a first-time protester. And they're like, I was just walking down a public road and I was arrested. I've done nothing wrong in my life ever. And I'm like, I know this and I love you. And that's not how the system works, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Is like people who are showing up and oftentimes have a lot of privilege, not always, but I think as the movement is getting bigger, we're seeing that there's more people who haven't really thought about a lot of these things, right? And so this is kind of the dynamic and who we're speaking to. Because there's a lot of people who have done nothing wrong who end up getting arrested. And I think also related to your point is talking about the fact that there are a lot of people who do not feel comfortable with law enforcement. And if we are using law enforcement to like make us more safe, it's actually making our movement spaces really inaccessible to people who are not comfortable and who have been historically targeted or, on their way to the protest are being targeted by law enforcement.
Look at Dartmouth. I guess that's an example of like that was the chillest protest. That was the safest place you could be until law enforcement showed up, and then people started getting hurt. It's sort of like how do we? But I think your point is valid, and I think that I can't see your name from here, but like your point too of like Teresa, like we're dealing with new folks and just being like we're kind of having this conversation with y'all with the understanding that you're going to continue having these conversations with more people, and like I think just listening to the values at the beginning of like compassion, and it's okay to like that we're all kind of figuring this out, figuring this balance out, and working with people who are new in a way that's like kind and gentle to the reality that nobody emerged from the womb of a woke activist that knows everything perfectly and has a complete understanding of the like complicated and violent history of policing. Like that's okay. We're all coming at this from different spots, and so like kind of trying to figure out how do we handle the law enforcement who are there, and how do we brainstorm other ways to keep each other safe so that we're not reliant on them in ways that alienate a significant other portion of the group of people that we want to be protesting with.
And say, I have nothing to hide, right? Like, I don't need to think about this stuff because I have nothing to hide. One, that's not how it works, but even if I accept your premise, what about the person next to you, right? Like, there might be someone who is much more vulnerable, who is showing up to a movement space, whether because of their immigration status, their race, their gender identity, like there, and on and on and on. Like, there are many reasons why people might be more vulnerable than you are, and so, I mean, not you, but, as you're having these conversations, if somebody is sort of raising that, it's not always just about you, right? A successful movement means that we have to make it accessible for people, and if you are not thinking about how to keep yourself safe, you're also not thinking about how to keep your networks safe and how to keep people safe that you are protesting with and that you want to keep protesting with in the future. So let's dive in. We're going to address 5 areas. 1, police interactions, 2, arrests, 3, interrogations, 4, criminal charges, and 5 is the big one, surveillance. So, police interactions. What is it? When you're interacting with police, you should assume that they are collecting information. They are looking for a reason to arrest you or someone else. They may not be, but if this is the assumption that you are operating under, it will help you have the mindset to keep yourself and others safe. Something that Kira taught me that I really like is that when you're interacting with law enforcement, everything that they say to you, you should preface in your mind that they're saying, I want you to believe that, blah, 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 blah. Because that, law enforcement is not only allowed to lie, they are trained to lie. They are trained in actually quite sophisticated manipulation techniques. And lying is certainly on the table. And so when you're engaging with law enforcement, whatever comes out of their mouth, preface that with, they want me to believe that, blah, 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 blah.
Prosecutors do, and anybody like COs. Do you want an example?
Yes.
Okay, I got one. Okay, so
Yeah.
No, did you have one in the back?
Yeah, there's a book called Green is the New Red, where they talk about how they brought in people from the environmental movement and told them that they're snitching on each other, which wasn't happening. So they got like people, like partners, to snitch on each other in their organizing.
Yeah, like, I'm a cop now, okay? So I just had an interview with Kira, and Kira actually said that you planned all these crimes, and Kira confessed fully because they wanted to get a lighter deal. And I'd be willing to offer you the same deal if you also confess, so that it's fair. So if you sign this statement, you'll get out of here with a misdemeanor. What am I really saying? I want you to believe that if you sign this statement, you'll get out of here with a misdemeanor. I want you to believe that Kira ratted you out. I want you to believe,
Yeah, which is such a great example because I have seen that so many times. The other biggie, big, is, and this is sort of jumping ahead, but let's say you've been arrested, you haven't been charged, you're sitting at the jail. That's when law enforcement is going to come and classically do their interrogation, but it might not feel like an interrogation. And something that they always say is, if you tell me your side of the story and tell me what really happened, and if you're honest with me, and if you're just honest and admit what you did, I'll talk to the prosecutor and I'll make sure that they know that you were honest with me and that you shouldn't be on the hook for X, Y, Z. What are they really saying? I want you to believe that if you admit to this, I will tell the prosecutor, oh, this person was honest when they admitted to this thing, give them a lighter offer. That's never happened. That's never, ever, ever happened. Not once has a prosecutor ever come to me and said, I'm going to give your client this great offer because they admitted to everything, but they like seemed nice when they did it. That's never happened, ever. And so, yeah, everything that you hear, you should preface with, I want you to believe that. But back to police interactions, so just like basic on the street interactions, right? What should you do? Ask if you're free to leave. If they say you are free to leave, leave. Simple as that. If they say you're not, go ahead, yeah.
If you ask if you're free to leave, what if they're lying about, they say no? I mean, is that also a possibility that they will say that when you really are free to leave? And how does one know the difference?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it's often not that simple, right? And law enforcement will sometimes say something evasive back to you, like,
Do you want to do a role play?
yeah.
Okay.
So I'm a cop.
Oh, you're the cop.
Oh, okay, you
Here,
got
take
it.
the cop hat.
Thanks.
I'm a passersby.
So I just have a couple questions.
Oh, hi, officer. Am I free to leave?
Well, I just have a couple questions for you, if you don't mind answering.
So I'd prefer to remain silent, and I'm just curious if I'm being detained or if I'm free to go.
Well, I mean, I'm not detaining you, but I just
Okay,
have a
so
couple quick questions.
since I'm
for
not
you.
being detained, I'll be on my
Well,
merry
what?
way. Thank you.
That's how it goes. You have to be kind of persistent. I've seen it last for a really long time where they keep, I had a case once where someone's vehicle was kind of blocked in, and so they kept like asking if they were free to leave, and technically they should have been free to leave, but like it was a weird roadway situation, and so they couldn't really move their car out of the way. And so law enforcement used that opportunity to just like keep peppering them with questions and questions. And this person actually did a really terrific job and just over and over and over again. Am I free to leave? I thought I was free to leave. I'm not answering your questions. If I'm not free to leave, I don't want to, I mean, that sort of skips ahead here, but.
So to answer your question directly, sometimes they'll fudge it, but your response should not change.
Yeah.
Your response should be, I have a right to remain silent, I'd like to leave, am I free to go?
And if you're really not free to leave in some situation because of
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
they need to tell you you're being arrested, or
They will let you know, for sure. If
Yeah.
you're like trying to make moves to leave, or you're like, I mean, I would not advise like just trying to make moves without asking, right? But if they've said, like if you've reasonably said over and over, like, am I free to leave? Am I free to leave? Am I being detained? And at no point have they said you're detained, and they just keep saying like, oh, I want to just ask questions or whatever. If you start like making moves, if you feel safe to do that, and you're not free to leave, they will make very clear that you're under arrest
Or being detained.
or being detained. Yeah.
Semantically, under arrest means they've got like full control over your body. They could give you a citation, they could take you into their car and take you to jail. Being detained, you still have control over your body, but they get to like keep you in one spot. So detention is supposed to be brief. Arrest.
Like at a scene if they think it's
Yeah.
like a car accident or a crime.
Exactly. Like if you get pulled over in your car, that's being detained. If you get like taken into the cruiser, that's being arrested.
Can you record this conversation? No,
Yeah.
can I, can I
Yeah.
record
Yes.
this conversation if they are trying to?
Yep. Totally.
And different states have different rules about whether it's a one-party or two-party consent state. So some states you can't secretly record, other states you can. I always advise to not try to memorize those rules and to always record openly so that they know you're recording, because A, that way you don't get in trouble for secret recording in a state where that's unlawful, and B, letting them know they're being recorded can help you with a little bit of accountability. So it's always a good idea to just say, hey, just so you know I'm recording.
Quality assurance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So accordingly. Other than that, lovingly shut the F up, okay? When I was a public defender in Maryland, I never had to litigate Miranda because there's a culture in the county where I was working where people just like don't talk to cops. People don't fuck with the cops. I came to Minnesota and I was getting Miranda cases all the time because there's something about like Minnesota nice where we just want to like chit chat and like, oh, like I'm cool, like whatever, like how's it going? Lovingly, shut the fuck up. Okay?
Even benign things give them a foothold to find what they need to escalate the interaction. Like they need reasonable suspicion to detain you, they need probable cause to arrest you. If I'm bantering to law enforcement, that gives them the opportunity to say, oh, your eye twitched, you're on drugs. Or like, oh, you did this, that means that. Like, oh, you said this, well, that's inconsistent with that, so now you're lying, and that's this. Like, just put that wall up so that they don't get those footholds or those pretexts.
Yep, absolutely. And then talking about arrest, which really, I guess, Kira mentioned there is this middle ground of detention. That matters a lot, like, after the fact in a court of law, like whether you were technically detained or whether you were under arrest. But as a general rule of thumb, what you should do, it doesn't really matter. So we're not kind of diving into that legalese because it's not, it doesn't change how you or someone else in a movement context or anyone really would want to interact with law enforcement.
Claire, if you go back to interactions, I think a lot of us have seen arrests, particularly by ICE, where they're masked, they are identifying markers are obscured. Should we be able to expect that they tell us who they are, what agency they're with, any other identifying markers?
I certainly
in a
think,
dream world.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, like, I certainly think so, and I would love to have a client, like, in terms of, like, jury trials that I would love to have an assaulting police officer case where the person who's alleged to be a police officer, or, like, ICE law enforcement, never identified themselves as law enforcement and never displayed a badge or, just, like, wearing a ball cap and a balaclava and, like, being super scary.
Yeah.
How do you know this isn't a kidnapping, right? But the reality is, like, whether the person is a kidnapper or an ICE agent, they probably have, like, a gun and a taser and, like, these are all really complicated and challenging things to navigate of, like, I can't tell you what to do in that moment, but I can tell you if you ended up charged with something like obstruction or assault or, the common things that I would imagine in that scenario, I think most defense attorneys would feel delighted to have that jury trial.
And just for context too, when we say law enforcement, when we're talking about, generally speaking, like ICE, Border Patrol, those are Department of Homeland Security sub-agencies that enforce the federal immigration laws. Sheriffs, local police officers, they enforce like state criminal laws. Then you've got the FBI that enforces, that they investigate. There's like federal drug and firearms enforcement agencies that enforce those federal. But the Constitution, with a couple of exceptions, generally speaking, when we talk about law enforcement, this applies to all of them. So in the same way that ICE can come up to anybody at any time and ask them questions, so can local sheriffs, so can local cops. You still have a right to remain silent regardless of who you're dealing with. The Constitution should apply the same to anybody regardless of documentation status. Like undocumented folks should have the same rights as U.S. citizens and everyone in between. Obviously, like what should happen, that's why I kind of like laughed sadly when you asked they have to identify themselves, is because like it doesn't play out that way, especially ICE. Like, I mean, if you watch the video of Rumeja Ozturk, the tough student getting like literally kidnapped, that was terrifying. Like they didn't identify themselves, they just, so like the how it actually plays out is different. The Constitution says all of these agencies are bound by the same restrictions with like very tiny limited exceptions, and all of us here have the same rights, but then how it plays out is completely different.
Did
there any, I guess, requirements locally about that that you know?
There was a consent decree that had a bunch of ways that Minneapolis law enforcement were supposed to interact with us, and that just got overturned, so.
There are lots of policies in place, very few actual laws or things like that.
That was my question, to follow up on that. So if we are, hypothetically confronted with these unmasked and unidentified people who aren't showing us a warrant, they're not showing identification, are we better to just lovingly STFU, or do we demand, like, show us your warrant? Who are you? Identify yourself. Like, what's the call there?
Yeah, I think that that's, again, like a complicated analysis. But yeah, in the moment, if someone is like, seems like they might be about to be kidnapped, and I'm not sure if the kidnapper is like, has the auspices of legality for that or not, yeah, I might like intervene and ask those types of questions. And at that point, and I guess like that is maybe a little asterisk exception, is asking questions is, I think, a slightly different category than answering questions, if that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. So I guess maybe some clarity on the line of what, if I am just an observer, I'm filming everything and I'm asking these questions, what vulnerability do I still have there? Just like the regular kind that we were already talking about?
Yeah, I mean, certainly like it's possible that law enforcement could end up targeting you as well. And like the kinds of things that I think we end up seeing in a situation like that would be like an obstruction charge would be most common. And obstruction in Minnesota has varying degrees based on like, if the state thinks that you're just like regular obstructing, that's a misdemeanor. But if the obstructive activity is creating some sort of like risk of harm, that can escalate it up to a gross misdemeanor or a felony even. In some pretty, like, this was something that ended up being litigated a lot during Line 3. There were folks that were charged with felony obstruction because they like climbed into a pipe, for example, and the state said, well, the pipe was really hot and so you could have died, and so we're charging you with felony obstruction because if you had died, that would be bad. It would be bad.
We're gonna protect you so hard, we're giving you a felony.
Yeah.
So as my defense lawyer, are you gonna get that knocked down to disorderly conduct? What are my chances? Or is that,
So
is that the old days?
Like law enforcement will typically, like, I get threatened with charges all the time when I like come up to film or observe law enforcement interactions. Notably, this happened in rural Vermont like a year or two ago when this cop was interrogating these like 15-year-olds in the middle of the night who were just out being teenagers, and the cops were going up, and I was like, hey officer, just clarifying that you're not interrogating minors without their like grown-ups present. And he was like, what? And then kind of got in my face, and then came and approached me and said, like, I'm gonna charge you with obstruction, or like I'm gonna charge you with interfering. And I did the thing, like, okay, he wants me to believe that he's gonna charge me with those things. But also it's like, it's nighttime, like, I'm short, he's tall, I'm scared, there's some kids here, he's getting really aggressive. Like, in that case, what the law says doesn't always matter as much as like how you try to like de-escalate the situation. And it's really crummy to think that like we have to be keeping each other and ourselves safe from, again, this, but like dropping the pitch of your voice and slowing your words down, taking some deep breaths and just like opening your body posture and saying something like, I'm not trying to interfere, I have a constitutional right to film, where can I stand so that I can see but I'm not in your way? And like really trying to like take the tone down to keep yourself safe, because it is totally true that like you get threatened with arrest all the time for filming. That is a very common occurrence and definitely something to be prepared for if you are like pulling your phone out when you're watching law enforcement try to arrest somebody. So really trying to say, hey, like, I have a right to film, not trying to get in your way, like, where can I stand? And like take that tone, and you might want to take a step back. If you're filming, you might want to put the, like, continuously film down to your shoes film yourself taking a step back. Say, hey, I'm stepping back. I'm just here to film. I'm not here to interfere. Whatever you can, and practice this. Like all of these phrases we're throwing out, go home and practice these, because if you're like me and you're really nervous, you want to word vomit the thing that is helpful, and that will be the muscle memory thing. Yeah.
When you were talking about like, this is sort of the situation where somebody is really under pressure, I kept thinking of that town hall, I think it was Montana, where the woman was dragged out of her seat. She was just doing what a lot of us would do, which is challenging her member of Congress and saying, hey, and then the sheriff basically he just told some guys who were tall, grab her, like it turns out, were not sheriff deputies or anybody, and she kept saying, who are you,
Yeah.
Her friends kept asking, and it's like, that to me seems like the kind of situation that is the sort of thing that I think will happen,
Yeah.
and is very hard to control, because it's like, you see the sheriff, you know him, and it's like, who are these guys, and where are they taking her? And what I wanted was for more of her friends, and when people were sitting in those damn auditorium chairs, to stand up and say, hey, stop.
Yes.
And people are so freaked out, most people aren't willing to do that.
Yeah.
Like that's the situation that I think about, like, oh, okay.
Yeah, there's I think been a lot of conditioning to comply, right? Like you think back to just being in kindergarten and you're just told to do whatever your teacher tells you to do, and like I understand why that is the case, but also like critical thinking is really important too, and being adept in a crisis is important too, and it's just a really hard thing to predict, but practicing is important. And I will say like a note about private security, because I'm not sure if I read it was that incident, but I thought that there was some like private security that had also been hired.
It was Idaho.
Yeah, okay, Idaho. And yeah, that's increasingly common and really, really scary. We saw that a lot during Line 3. That was also something happening a lot during Standing Rock. The fossil fuel industry in particular has gotten really good at having these collaborations between corporate security and local law enforcement, and they end up just like working together, and those lines get blurred, and law enforcement ends up seeing the security as just like one of them rather than this like really questionable mercenary, even beyond like the bounds of our current legal system. Yeah, like during Line 3 we saw really wild collaboration, including like private security being invited to the like mass surveillance and being given access to information that like even as defense attorneys we still have not been able to get.
Meanwhile, Enbridge is paying like $300-400 a night for the cops to stay in these really nice hotel rooms to attend these secret meetings where they plan how to like surveil protesters.
This has all been really interesting, but I'm concerned that we haven't even done number 2 yet. So I would like to ask that people keep apocryphal or stories sort of to a minimum so we can get
to the nuts and
political
bolts.
matter.
We've got 2 pages left on our outline out of 5, so we're
We'll
actually
get there.
Yeah. Okay, so when you get arrested, this means that either law enforcement has probable cause, meaning like 51% or more likely that you did something, or they have a warrant. That's the level that they need to arrest you. And again, probable cause is a nebulous term. Like there's no way to actually quantify whether it's 51% likely or not that you did a thing.
I think it's actually lower than 51.
Okay, so it's even lower than that. So I've been wrong for years because it never has mattered, because they can just say I have probable cause.
It's all amorphous.
I got one fact. I got probable cause. You're under arrest. So it's an amorphous standard, but really what it means is like they are taking control over your body. It's the same standard for a search as well. So when you get arrested, you're subject to a search incident to an arrest, where they get to look through everything in your backpack, on your person, in your pockets. This is why so many black and brown folks get arrested for jaywalking and white people never do. Is because law enforcement are like, oh, if I arrest you for jaywalking, then I get to search you for drugs. And so it's sort of like a double, just like if you are in a situation where you think you're about to get arrested, like know that they're gonna look through your pockets. So in preparing for that, you know, obviously like if you have a diary where you write down all your crimes, don't bring that to like a situation where you think you're gonna get arrested. Other things, like they're really interested in our social networks. They're very interested in mapping us, and like they have access to that because they know all of our phones are in this room together, so they're gonna know. They have access to everybody's like Facebook profiles and suggested friends lists, and like they have a lot of access to that data, but like not giving them more than they already have. So being good about like if you're gonna be arrested, they're gonna go through your pockets. You probably don't want to have the receipt where you bought all the spray paint for the graffiti that just magically appeared somewhere nearby. Like those types of like be mindful of that. Your phone. Do people know what biometrics is? Have we heard of the? Yeah, you don't want the face or the thumbprint. You want a long passcode. You don't want your messages to pop up on your lock screen. You want to really just like kind of, I think as much as you can emotionally prepare, like being arrested can be a really traumatic experience. And even if it's not for you, it might be for the people around you too. So just like if you're going to jail, recognize that like the people around you might have just had like one of the worst days of their lives. So kind of just trying to give yourself a bunch of grace and compassion for what you've just gone through, and the people around you. We don't really know. Like sometimes it can be kind of like we see this and we grapple with this as defense attorneys. Like there's this dichotomy between like the protesters, like the hero criminals, and then the people that are being criminalized for like existing in a world that like passes laws against being poor or being trans or being black or whatever it might be. So like
The real criminals.
Yeah, like we're all in this together, and in this means like this mess of a society, or this we might all be in jail together. And we're just like kind of going through it, and it might be hard. You might experience an adrenaline crash, and I don't know about you, but when my adrenaline crashes, I get like really blathery, and it's not the place to be. Jail is not the place to be wanting to process your arrest experience, because there's ears everywhere. There's like, you want to like not give law enforcement any extra information, whether they are directly asking you questions or whether you're just coming down from your adrenaline crash. I have a beloved client who likes to prepare questions in advance that are very safe to blather about. So he gets arrested and then he goes to jail and he asks everybody what their medium favorite bird is. And then I see that in the discovery report and I go, nice job, dude. So like really just like I don't consent to like I don't want to talk. You can give them like your basic information that might be found on a driver's license. Like they're gonna want your name, your address, your phone number, your birthday, like those types of things. But if they start asking you what do you do for a living, like who's your friends, what are your all these kind of like questions that go beyond the scope of basic biographical information.
Where were you before you got arrested?
Yeah, like what were you doing that led to your arrest? Who did you carpool with? Who's picking you up from jail? Like you do not want to consent to any extra conversation. Like you have a right to remain silent, but they're going to trick you into waiving it. So I want to speak to a lawyer. I have a right to remain silent. That's it. They might go through your stuff, but like don't consent to any searches beyond what they already have. Like don't consent to them looking through your phone. Yeah.
That was my question. They have to ask for permission to access your phone, and you can say no.
This is why biometrics are so important, because if you have biometrics on your phone, they don't have to ask your consent to just grab your phone and go and open it and then access all of your stuff. But if you have a passcode, they have to ask your permission to type in the passcode. Now they do have a thing called Cellbrite, which is really good at hacking devices. It is better at hacking Droids than iPhones. So as much as I'm like not a Mac stan, I do personally have an iPhone and a like Mac, just because like of hacking risks. But I also did recently see that there is a new operating system for I think the Pixel that So yeah, that's the why behind the not using your finger or your face to open your devices, because they don't have to ask for that.
And just a couple other notes about like kind of this is just like informational, the process of being arrested. They could give you a citation, like a piece of paper that tells you what you're being charged with in your next court date, and they could let you go. Sometimes that's common in like, nonviolent protests where there's a ton of people getting arrested, they don't want to deal with the hassle. Or they could physically transport you, whether that's in the back of a squad car. Everything you say in the back of that squad car is going to be recorded. Or they could put you in a bus, like a city bus or a school bus, and take you to any kind of facility. So those are the kind of like cite and release is one thing that might happen, or getting taken somewhere and booked.
And back of a squad car, very common place where the chit chat happens.
Yeah.
You might have a long ride. In northern Minnesota, the jails were so full because so many people were getting arrested. They were actually jailing people in a high school gymnasium at one point. But because of that, they were transporting people to other facilities around in different counties, which means a really long ride in that car. Just because you're bored or you're freaked out or whatever you're experiencing, it doesn't mean that any of our rule of thumb changes.
Yeah.
Lovingly, I hear it's hard. STFU.
Yeah.
Like, just, it's for your own good. And that's also like, law enforcement is often trained to start like the chit chat at that point as well. And so just keep in mind, like, they want me to believe that, blah, 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 blah. And they're trained to start like chit-chatting because I'm just sitting here and...
So whose idea was this anyway? Like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So...
Quick question.
Yeah.
What about in the instance of like you're detained in the back of a police vehicle or law enforcement vehicle, they didn't take your phone from you. What about sending a quick text message?
I don't know a situation where someone was ever put in the back of a police vehicle when they still had their phone. Well, and
I've seen it.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it depends on the text. Like, if you're like, Mom, I got arrested, like, I think that's fine.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
If you're like, hide the evidence.
Right. My first instinct would be like, let my family know, hey, heads up, this is probably going to happen. So.
Right. So that brings us to the next part of being arrested, which is the like, what happens in jail? How do you get out? Your one phone call, that kind of thing. So,
well, and also I would just be mindful to like, if you have made the calculation that you're in a place where you can like send a, hey, like I'm under arrest text, you want to lock your phone after that.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, that was my other question was, based on the recording, would they be able, like, are they sneaky enough to pull that, try to figure out, like, what your passcode was? Can they see that?
Generally the cameras are going to be like in the front and like.
So just don't do it. That sounds like the better plan.
I would say it's a small risk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not the worst thing you could do. Ideally, you would have a kind of contingency plan in advance if you know you're going to get arrested. But just to kind of like contextualize this, like hundreds of thousands of millions of people get arrested all the time at a moment's notice, and it's okay. It's scary, and there might be a period where you like aren't in constant contact with your loved ones, your emergency contact, but like it is kind of like jail's function is to strip us of our autonomy and our agency, and so there might be a period of time where like we can't pee, like we don't, like the food's horrible, like you're gonna be watching people, maybe detoxing, and it's gonna be like really hard and scary, and like there's periods of uncertainty and a total lack of control, and it's sort of just like is the bigger picture of why do we have such a dehumanizing system in the first place, and like it's just sometimes it's just really horrible. Sorry.
Jail always smells
Yeah.
like bologna and urine and bleach. Those three smells always.
So like, give yourselves grace and like compassion and find ways to take care of yourselves and each other like throughout this experience. I always
they
like.
have to let you get the medicines that you need.
So this is I'm gonna cover all of the jail logistics, and then if I miss anything, let's ask questions.
Yeah.
If you have medication that is like you take every day, you need to take it, you can't miss it, don't just put it in like an empty mint container. And like they're not gonna give you that. Like it has to be in the proper prescription. Like take the prescription bottle with your meds that has your name on it, the like orange thing, and and that is like that's what they'll give you.
And make
Sometimes
sure the sticker is still on there, because like if it's like torn and it doesn't have your name on it,
or if it's
you're not getting
expired
all that.
because you get refills and you just put them in the same old jar, they'll sometimes say no to that. Like it has to be like the current jar. They're really sticklery about that. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself, and do whatever advocacy you can if they are hesitant to give you medications that you need. If you if they're giving you like, I had a client just recently like who was lied to and was given meat, like non-halal meat, and like they said it was fake meat and like that kind of thing. They're gonna lie, they're gonna mistreat you, they're gonna give you food that you might be allergic to. Like being prepared for that and like not trusting anything, and not trusting that they will follow their own rules, because it's so widespread the violations of human rights that occur when people are incarcerated. Like pretrial arrests are no different than that.
It also, I will just say, like, jail policies around prescription medications can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So there are also some jails that will not give you anything that was on you when you were arrested, but if a loved one can bring your prescription bottle to the jail, they will then give you that. Or you may, like, if something happens and you're not able to access it, you are going to want to make a call, a sick call, to get FaceTime with the nurse as soon as possible, so you can explain to them what prescriptions you need, and hopefully you can get those as soon as possible.
And like for folks who are on like hormones or gender affirming therapies and whatnot, like that is also going to vary state by state, depending on like some facilities, like trans women in Florida are like preparing to, or if not have already gone like cold turkey off of hormones because of these new draconian laws. So like that's going to vary state to state, and maybe that's a question we could do a one-on-one about if that's anybody's situation here. But just checking checking to see what the policy is, if you know in advance what region you're going to and you have like a really life-saving medication that you need to take is a good idea. You are offered one phone call. Be really careful with that phone call. That is like very recorded and very listened to and very potentially incriminating. If you are able to, like a lot of people have this kind of like, I want to talk to an attorney right away. Like sharing the legal facts of your situation is like actually not a great idea, especially on that initial phone call because it's recorded. But even if you're talking to an attorney, like really sharing your side of the story is not going to help you get out. Like they don't make a like, did you do it or not determination to get you out of jail. They make a, are you a danger to the community or not determination. That's what gets you bailed out or gets your bail set. So like oftentimes it's kind of like just trying to hang tight and let the process run its course, even though that feels scary to just wait, is better than like rushing to tell your side of the story on a jail phone call that like is not secure.
Yeah, there's like oftentimes I can see with folks that are not familiar with the system, there's this like feeling of like, I gotta tell someone I'm innocent and then surely they'll let me out. That's not how it works. And I think you were mentioning like, in particular, talking to a lawyer over the phone. There's some, like sometimes you can get a lawyer on a confidential line. I never 100% trust those, but it's, in theory that would be a confidential phone call. You should definitely like talk to your lawyer if you're having a phone conversation about like what is okay for me to tell you on this phone call versus not. But yeah, generally jail phones are for calling your loved one to say, hey, I need my medication. Hey, I'm having this problem at the jail. And hey, like, can you please make sure you feed my cat? Or hey, like, have you gotten in touch with a lawyer yet? Like, do you know when the lawyer is going to be able to talk to me? Like, those are the kind of logistical questions to have on the jail phone, nothing substantive.
And then when you do, like, just, oh yeah.
So that
here's
to
the
the jail.
basics, like can someone go to the jail and just check in with this person, or what have you. These things take time, right? So probably the biggest rule of thumb when you're in jail is be patient. Jail is meant to make you feel isolated and alone and afraid. But you have a community, your community is working for you. We've all we've set up the NLG hotline, we've done the things, we've talked to our friends, we let them know that we were going to a protest, we took off the biometrics on our phone. So we're just going to the jail, and maybe you can go ask to go to the library and just get a book, if you have access to that at that particular jail, and just read a book.
I think it's a good idea if you can, so you can take the hotline, you can write the number down. I don't advise writing it on your arm, because sometimes if you're writing it as a precaution but not intending to get arrested or risk arrest, they'll be like, you got a hotline number, you must be doing crime. So if you want to write it maybe out somewhere less visible, as a precaution, that's fine. But an even better alternative might be actually to be hey, trusted family member or loved one, I'm going to a protest. I may or may not be getting arrested, I'm not trying to, but it could happen. Can I call you? And here's the things that I'm going to need you to do. And have a conversation with them in advance, so that you're not on the phone being here's all the things that I'm telling you and inadvertently the government. And that they know, okay, if you get arrested, this is where your cat lives, this is who needs to be notified, this is your lawyer's number, kind of get them all and they can do that check, because the hotline is going to be like a relay, and you can skip the relay by just directly calling your loved one with your one call, and the hotline is more for people that didn't have the time to have that conversation in advance. And then when you get a visit from an attorney, to kind of go behind the veil here. When I do jail visits for folks, my actual main goal is just is this person okay? It is more of a wellness check, because I want to know, okay, are they being deprived of any medication? Do I need to do any kind of advocacy with jail supervisors? Are they injured? Are they freaking out? It's a kind of, are you okay? And let me remind you of your right to remain silent, and do a check-in with you to tide you over. And then I'm going to maybe get some information about to prepare for the bail hearing, because that's how you get out of jail. Is if you are either, sometimes they just let you go. The 36-hour hold is common in the Twin Cities in Hennepin County. You get arrested, they don't really have evidence to charge you with a crime. They hold you for 36 hours to make a point, and then they just let you go. That's a probable cause hold, and no charges come of that. So that can happen. Or you could get arrested, and then there is a charge, and you get a bail hearing, which is how you get out of jail. And the factors that go into bail usually are is this person a danger to the community? Are they a flight risk? So I might want to know, okay, is this person's first offense, or is this their 20th offense? Do they have family in the area? How much money do they have? Are they going to be able to post? Is a small bail a huge deal for them? Those types of things. So those questions, but none of it is did you do this? Are you innocent? What's our trial argument going to be? Our trial argument is not at all part of the bail conversation. Really, it's about, are you okay? And let's get you out of here.
Yeah. The trial is going to happen months down the road. So just to sort of recap here, I think we've talked about most of this, but if you're asking for consent to search, do not consent. You want to speak with a lawyer, you're invoking your right to remain silent. Other than that, you're just going to comply with commands. You don't want to do something that's going to tack on a resisting charge. There's this example here of somebody going limp. Unless there's a reason, there's 1,000 people who've all decided to go limp at once for some action, this might just get you a resisting or an obstruction charge for no reason.
And,
so you might
injured.
Yeah, and you could get injured. You might just want to comply is sort of the general rule of thumb there.
Or not, but just know the risks of not doing that.
Yeah.
We're not trying to tell you to not, just know that risks an extra charge, and that can be a source of injury.
And we've talked about citation versus where they actually bring you to the jail and book you. You might get fingerprinted. We talked about the transport and the holding. The sort of saying is you can beat the rap, but you can't beat the ride. It's also the process is the punishment, which is sort of that 36-hour hold that Kira was talking about, where even if you're not ultimately going to be charged, they might just keep you in jail just to punish call everybody, lock them away for 36 hours. They're not even intending to charge people, just as a way to quell the protest activity. We saw that in particular after Trump's, after the 2024 election, there were some protests where that happened. Be patient, again, lovingly, STFU. Just get that tattooed on my forehead at this point. We talked about the jail phones. Okay, one other quick note before we wrap up. Here's the hotline for the Minnesota NLG. Probably good to know. And
it's not on all the time.
Yeah, so if you want to get it turned on, honestly, maybe contact one of us, but you can also just contact the general NLG website has information for how to get in touch with the Minnesota National Lawyers Guild. Also, don't sleep on public defenders. There's definitely some really phenomenal public defenders. I'm a former public defender. If folks qualify for the public defender, there's really no harm in at least filling out an application, or if you think you might qualify, apply and see if you get one. Public defenders oftentimes have so much great information about how to navigate a local system, because every local court system is different, and so when a lawyer like Kira or myself is getting called into a jurisdiction that we're not familiar with, being able to collaborate with a public defender is just, it elevates everybody's cases, because that person is going to know, this judge is like this, or, here's the strategy here. It's just cannot be understated. Interrogation, we already sort of talked about as well. It's going to be not like the movies, right? Interrogation is not going to be bright light, you did it. That's not what happened. It's going to be not what happens. It's going to be a very, this is where they turn up the good cop dial as high as they can and are trying to chit chat and tell you all these lies about, if you're just honest with me, I'll get you off the hook. Or, hey, you better tell me your side because your co-defendant over in the other room told me you did everything, so you better spill the beans, right?
And you started the morning by making him pancakes. And you might have thought it's okay to just share that I had pancakes for breakfast because that's benign, but then they take those little details and they use it to make their lies believable. So even saying that you had pancakes for breakfast is a silly example. It has actually happened before. That is the little grain of truth that is used to make the rest of the lie believable. So it's really just best to say, hey, respectfully, I have a right to remain silent. I want an attorney, and not give them any footholds.
As an example, the officer asks me when I'm in the interrogation room, what'd you have for breakfast? Oh, I said, I had pancakes. I made pancakes for me and my friend Kira. Well, they're gonna go to the interrogation room and be like, Claire spilled the beans. She told me everything. She told me even about how she made pancakes.
With the pancakes.
Yeah, and now Kira's thinking, oh shit, Claire really did spill the beans, right? So
because we did have pancakes.
I thought it would be totally fine, but that ends up being used to make Kira feel more vulnerable, and now the security and safety of this whole community is slowly being eroded because I'm not lovingly STFUing. Okay, same stuff. We talked about the criminal charges. The last little thing to keep in mind, we also talked about the surveillance stuff and what to do, but just the one other thing I wanted to make sure we talked about before we end is end-to-end encryption. If you can use an end-to-end encrypted messaging, like Signal is the most common one that folks are usually somewhat familiar with. What end-to-end encryption means is when I send a message to Kira can read it on their phone, I can read it on my phone, but Signal doesn't have a third repository where they're reading what we send each other. Google, not encrypted at all. Google, when I send a Google message through Gmail or GChat or whatever to Kira, Google keeps a copy of whatever we send. And when law enforcement sends a subpoena or a warrant, if they can get it, but oftentimes it'll just be a subpoena, Google will readily hand over all of our communications. And even if it's something that we feel is innocuous, it could later be used to even just map our network.
And a lot of these technology platforms might say that they're end-to-end encrypted, like Google does have encryption, but it has the keys to its own encryption. So if law enforcement says, hey, could you show us that? They'll so there's like people that they can't like take a parcel of data out of the air because it's encrypted, but they can go to Google and ask for the keys to the encryption.
And if I have something that has been created or sent through Google and I delete that,
Still there.
still have
You
that.
see people even like there was a case where people were communicating via Gmail drafts, and they like shared a
Like
Google
Google Docs.
login. Not even the docs, the draft emails.
Oh.
So they would go to their drafts of their shared Gmail and they would type something, and then the other person would go to the drafts, edit it. Google keeps those. Like Google has everything. So using Signal, but then also setting yourself up for success by like set your Signal has like disappearing message timers. If you set it to like 5 minutes, and people are tempted to screenshot, and where does that go? The Apple Cloud. So like trying to make sure that you're not screenshotting things that are encrypted in a way that would lose the encryption. If you use like CryptPad or some of these encrypted things, but you're sending the documents or the links over Gmail, you're creating holes in the encryption. Like accessibility is also a security concern too. So we want to make sure we're not like being so hyper tech sensitive that we can't, that like folks who are bad at tech, like we want the boomers in the movement. We need you, So like being accessible is also important, and like being secure is also, how do we balance that? I think it's by working together to find ways that are like usable and like being gentle with each other when like we don't know what this new fangled technology is or whatever, but also getting off like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram Messenger, all of those are like heavily surveilled, and yeah.
What about, and I am a boomer, so this is a dumb question, but so when we're organizing and planning our Zoom meetings, like are those okay? I mean, to speak
Yeah.
freely, or they are still, or do we not know?
There's a caveat. There's a couple caveats.
There's a great
there.
debate over this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great question.
So Zoom is allegedly end-to-end encrypted, but if you have anyone joining via a phone, that breaks the end-to-end encryption, and there's some concern that it's not actually end-to-end encrypted in the Zoom. I mean, one thing that, for example, I think Signal is open source, and so like the general public can verify like this is actually. I mean, I can't because I'm not a tech person, but people who like code can look at it and be like, this is legit. Zoom is not that way, and so we're sort of taking their word.
And if you have the AI feature turned on, because AI stores data and uses it, that's another. So I would say like, sorry, I swallowed Red Bull down the wrong throat. Technology is like never totally secure. You could have like a screen reader on your device. You could have something bugged. You could have like, if you really want to have a totally personal conversation, like you probably need to meet in person and like not have your phones with you, like to be totally secure. It is my firm position that the vast majority of organizing should be lawful. Like there's so much work that we can do that is not unlawful. Like the bus boycotts would not have happened, but for like the bake sales, that was mostly Black women that like baked cookies, baked all this, raised all this money to like help get people to work, to help do the mutual aid and the care work that made it possible for a very small number of people to like do civil disobedience. So like so much of what we're doing, even though it's surveilled, even though they don't want us to be doing it, is like stuff that we at least theoretically should be able to do above board. And like if it's okay, like just being kind of like really secure about the really secretive stuff, and being really open and public and inviting about the stuff where we're like, we actually want as many people to be doing this because it's like broad-based movement building, and kind of trying to figure out how to balance that, and like recognizing that the risk for me is going to be different than somebody with a green card. The risk for me is going to be different than somebody who's out on probation, or like who has kids, or like all these different, so like kind of finding ways to like consent to the risks that we make, and also make it possible for other people to like be more risk averse if they're in a different situation. Like it's such a kind of negotiated balance that is another one of my favorite rants that I could save for another time. I see you have your hand up. We'll get to you.
Oh yeah, thanks, Karen. You teed up most of the substance of what I was about to say, which is that
One of our downside risks is people not coming on board.
and so we have to have the to invite people on board in the ways that works with them. We have to communicate with people so that they hear we're doing the protest. I
Yeah,
speak with
for
people
sure.
every day conversation. Have you heard about No Kings Day?
Yeah.
Lots of folks have not.
Right.
So we got to get the word out, and I'm not afraid of that. If there's a dossier about me, it is big and thick and unambiguous because I've been opposing
Right.
Trump throughout since 2017.
Right.
But yeah, we keep one another
Yeah.
safe by communicating thoughtfully, mostly, about things that we could put on the front page of the New York Times and no one would care.
Right, like the bake sale, like you don't want to become so paranoid about surveillance that you're keeping the bake sale in Signal only,
Yeah.
right? The bake sale should
Right.
be on Facebook
We're
events.
just buying the same 10 cookies
Yeah.
from each other with our same 5.
Yeah.
So
It's
I
not
think
gonna be so bad.
it's about recognizing that we're all coming at this from different places, and we've got different like passions and vocations and like gifts that we bring to the movement and risks. And so like the people who are like out front being like, I'm doing something, that's awesome with a thick dossier. There might be other people who really have to like be low key. Like me as an attorney, like I have to be really careful not to do crime, especially in public, do I jaywalk? I'm not gonna say. But what did we say about not confessing to crimes in this recorded conversation? But like my risk tolerance is very different than other folks who might be able to be more open about stuff and like really just trying to be strategic about the risks that we subject other people to so that we can have accessible movement spaces so that I'm not being like flippant about risks that I'm taking in a way that like makes it so my friend can't also come to the protest because they've got like, they're undocumented or they're going through these other criminal proceedings or whatever it might be.
And just a note on accessibility, we're doing this rant.
That's the rant.
So,
yes.
yeah, we made it. So, just a note on accessibility, one of the organizers that I work with, like when the end time comes, she's like, it's over, sorry, there's more everyone wants to talk about. We could all talk about a whole lot more, you gotta go.